Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I'd like to try to get started on time this evening, if we could, so we all get a chance to spend the most time with our speaker. So welcome to the Fralin Biomedical Research Institute of VTC, the Maury Strauss Distinguished Public Lecture. I'm looking around, I don't think I see Maury this evening. He couldn't make it, but I just want to acknowledge again Maury Strauss and Strauss family for their generous endowment of this program that, as everybody knows, brings these great speakers to the community. So we're very grateful for that support. The plug and the ad for the next talk is next week. We'll have Dr. Cameron Rathmell from the Vanderbilt Ingram Cancer Center here speaking. Same time, same station. Okay, so we look forward to seeing many of you then. So it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia University. Dr. Sachs is the Adolphe Quetelet Professor of Sustainable Development. For those of you who don't know who Adolphe Quetelet was, he was a very well-known Belgian astronomer who introduced statistical methods to the social sciences. So a very distinguished position to hold at Columbia University. Dr. Sachs is also the director of the Center for Sustainable Development and the University Professor of Economics. Also serves as Professor of Health Policy and Management, and he previously directed the Earth Institute at Columbia University. He has earned his degrees all at Harvard University, his undergraduate, his master's, and his Ph.D., and then he went on to serve as a faculty member at Harvard. The most recent position he had there was the Galen Stone Professor of International Trade. Dr. Sachs currently serves as special advisor to the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and previously advised other UN Secretaries General, including Ban Ki-moon and Kofi Annan. Some of you may have noticed recently an address from the United Nations, I think it was just in the last couple of weeks or so, by the Secretary General, where they discussed the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, urging member states to stop runaway climate change, and having a goal of net zero global emissions by 2050. And certainly our speaker tonight, Dr. Sachs, has been instrumental in advising the leadership of the world, including through the United Nations, on policies related to this. He has received numerous prizes in recognition for his many contributions, including a co-recipient of the Blue Planet Prize. He's a distinguished fellow of the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis in Austria, and he's a syndicated columnist in papers that are published in lots of countries, well over 100. He's also a best-selling author. I'm sure many of the people in this audience have read a number of his books. There are too many to mention. But I think some of the titles of his books tell a lot, for those of you who aren't as familiar with his work, about the contributions in the areas of focus of Dr. Sachs, such as A New Foreign Policy Beyond American Exceptionalism, The End of Poverty, The Measure of America, The Price of Civilization, The Age of Sustainable Development, Improving Access and Efficiency in Public Health Service. So these are some of the topics that Dr. Sachs has not only developed insightful information to be used by leaders around the country, but has actually worked very closely for the implementation of policy that is affecting all of our lives and hopefully into the future help us to deal with some of the most demanding problems that we as a civilization and as a species and as a planet face. One last thing I want to say, since I mentioned a number of his publications, is I found out in a conversation today he almost had another publication last week before a certain press release in New York, but it didn't quite make it in time. I don't know if he was going to talk about that. But nonetheless, it is truly a great honor and a privilege to have somebody who's made the contributions, with the background, the recognition, and the import, is Dr. Jeffrey Sachs with here this evening. Please join me in welcoming him.
There we go. Okay. Good evening, and thank you so much for hosting me and for enabling me to be with you today and to meet really remarkable scholars that I've had the chance to be with all afternoon. The work that is taking place at VTC is absolutely astounding, cutting edge, fascinating. I'm carrying home a big stack of papers to start reading and learning, but I'm very, very grateful to get to know this community and to get to know a little bit Roanoke. It's my first visit and first hours, and it's a beautiful place, and so I'm really thrilled to have the chance to be here. And I'm very pleased that I have a chance to share some thoughts with you about the state of our country right now, which is not as good as it should be. I will discuss that in the context of an idea that I've devoted my professional life to because I believe in it, and I want to share the idea and explain why I think it's a practical and useful concept, and that is the idea of sustainable development. This is a kind of buzzword in some places, or a strange sounding idea in others, or not at all discussed in others, but it is an approach to our social life. It is an idea about what a good, healthy, happy, flourishing society should be. And it is the idea that has been taken up in a kind of fragile way by all of the governments in the United Nations, in that they have adopted this idea. I don't know how many know what it means, how many care about it, how many implement it, but they've at least adopted the idea. And my job at the UN, which I spend a lot of time on, is to try to make the idea real, because I believe in it and think that it should make a difference. So what is this idea? Sustainable development is the idea of a decent society that is based on three basic pillars. One is economic well-being, or economic prosperity, or economic growth. The second is social justice, that the society works for everybody. In the UN, we say leave no one behind, whether it's women facing discrimination, or minorities facing discrimination, or people that are excluded from the benefits of society for whatever reason. And the third pillar of sustainable development is environmental sustainability. Let's not wreck the planet. And I regard this combo, sometimes called the triple bottom line of economic, social, and environmental objectives, as kind of duh, what else? What else should we be doing? And yet, this is not how our societies are organized. First, we're not really organized around any very clear goals, by the way, except maybe make America great again, whatever that means. But it's not clear what is that supposed to mean, and what would great be for a society. Great meaning you can pounce on someone else, or you're better than someone else, or people are flourishing in the society. They're leading good lives that are of value and that are fulfilling lives. Our economy is really organized around the first of these pillars. It's actually not bad at creating economic growth. And growth is usually defined as gross domestic product per person. And a lot of our societies around the world, and this country, is what is the growth rate? What's going to be the growth rate next year? Can we raise the growth rate? Is it going to be 3.1 or 3.3? I've got the highest growth rate ever, and so forth. But what does that really mean? Is it producing the kind of lives we want? And even if it is a good thing, and on the whole, it is a good thing to have economic growth and development, if it's not well shared, if it's leading to incredible inequalities between the rich and the poor, if people can't even hold on except to read in the newspaper the stock market's up, but they don't own anything in the stock market, and the economy's booming, but they can't meet the bills that month, what's the point? And so economic growth is really the orientation that we are in. Social justice, not so much. Of course, people have different ideas about what social justice is, but I think a lot of people feel a lot of injustice in this society, that somehow this system isn't really working broadly for people, that there are a lot of people left out of a decent life, even a manageable life. And I don't think we spend much time on that, although we yell at each other a lot about it. But what I can tell you for sure is that the kind of market economy we have is not designed or organized to produce social fairness or social justice. If we want it, we have to make it happen. It's not going to happen by itself. The market system by itself produces inequality. That's almost inherent. It's amplified in our country because those who have money buy the politics also. And so it's not just that markets lead to inequality, but the inequality leads to inequality of power, and then the power inequality creates powerful industrial groups that then chisel us, basically. And so we've got a pretty bad cycle in this country of rising inequality of income that is so far unabated over the past 50 years. And it's really a process that's been going on intensively for the last 35 years or so. And a market economy is by no means, in no way, organized to protect the natural environment. And so that third pillar is either just ignored or denied, or we pretend, or we suffer, one of those. If you read the Wall Street Journal each day, and I'm sure many of you do, it's an excellent newspaper except for those 3 pages at the end of the first section called opinion pages, which are all false. Every word about the environment. Every word today was no different. I'm writing some responses today. Complete nonsense. Why? Well, in this case, because Mr. Murdoch likes the oil industry. And a lot of this issue is bad news for us, which is that coal, which this part of the country grew up on and helped to build the rest of the country, oil and gas, which is still being developed, will wreck our planet. It just will. And that's not good news. But the reaction is basically of those who are in power to lie about it, or to not care at all, or like our president, to know nothing about it. So he says whatever happens to come to his tweeting mind. And that's a big problem. So the economy by itself will not produce sustainable development. That's the main point. If you want a society that is prosperous, fair, and sustainable, it has to be by design. If you want a society that is rich, that can happen with a market system. It's just probably you and I won't be part of the rich part. But it will be rich. But it will not be fair and it will not be sustainable. And for anybody in economics, in school or in studies, if you learn about the invisible hand of the market, forget it. It's a little bit clever about making money, but it's not clever about fairness or about environmental sustainability. It's completely blind, non-existent for those categories. So, we've got big environmental crises globally. We have rising inequality of wealth and income globally and nationally. And the governments of the world have claimed, at least now for 27 years, since 1992, to want to do something about this, because the concept of sustainable development was first adopted actually in 1992 at what was called the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. And at that summit, a treaty was signed on climate change, which the US is party to. It says we have to stop human-made climate change. That's the law of our land, because we are part of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. We're doing nothing at the government level in Washington about that, actually. But in 2012, 20 years after the Rio Earth Summit, 20 years of sustainable development in quotation marks with no results, more inequality, more environmental destruction, the governments came together at another conference, again in Rio. I was there. It was the saddest conference I've ever been at, because it was looking back 20 years. What did we accomplish? Well, nothing. And they said, we better try again to make kind of brighter light goals on sustainable development. And they came up with 17 goals. Okay, let me explain that. 17. 3 would have been enough, right? 2 is a lot already. This is the UN. There are 193 countries. So they started with a list that had 300 goals. And they negotiated for 3 years. And they got it down to 17. And they were exhausted. And they pounded the hammer, and that was the end. So we have 17 sustainable development goals. And the US, it was President Obama at the time, and all the other 192 governments signed what is called the Agenda 2030, which is a globally agreed framework to make a world economy and national economies that are prosperous, fair, and environmentally sustainable. And I view my little neck of the woods in this as doing whatever I can, which is my meager efforts to not have happen in the next 20 years what happened in the first 20 years, which is nothing. Because it's easy to announce things, it's harder to achieve them, especially when there's nothing intrinsic in the way our politics and economy works that automatically makes things fair or automatically protects the environment. So these 17 goals are actually quantitative objectives. Behind them are specific numbers of what should be accomplished by the year 2030, or in the case of climate, by 2050. Because a few weeks after these goals were adopted, the Paris Climate Agreement was adopted. Remember, in December 2015. That's the one that Trump wants to pull our country out of. Let me just give you one footnote about that. That's a very good agreement. Weak, probably, because like all international agreements, it's very hard to enforce what you agree to. But it's an agreement that doesn't name one country. It's for all 193 countries. Yet our president says it's unfair to the United States. I look at it all the time. The US isn't mentioned in this thing. Everything's completely symmetrical across all 193 countries. No one's singled out. But it's unfair to the United States. And so we're the only country out of all 193 that has declared the intention to leave the Paris Climate Agreement. We must not do that. This would be awful for us, not good for the world. We have to actually accomplish the measure of safety that we agreed to. Now, these goals and the Paris Climate Agreement, that's the package of sustainable development. And when you look across these goals, they seem either, are you kidding? or very aspirational, or wouldn't that be nice, but you're in a dream world. Goals like no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being for all, quality education, and so forth. Actually, behind them are metrics and some systematic definitions. It's not actually no poverty, but no poverty so extreme that you can't survive is really what that first goal is about. The goal of no hunger is a goal that everybody on the planet should have enough calories and basic nutrients to be able to be healthy and functional. By the way, something completely practically achievable if we cared to achieve it. The quality education is that every child on the planet should be able to complete at least a secondary school education. Are you kidding? How could any child have a chance in the 21st century without at least a high school education? There are no jobs for people without a high school education anywhere in the world that are outside of poverty. And so this is basic. Also practical, by the way. The technology of putting a kid in a classroom is not advanced. It may require a budget and some organization and some help and some training, but it's not beyond our means. So the goals here, while they are very high-minded, are actually really grounded and practical, but by no means likely to be achieved. Because to achieve them, we'd have to care. And not only care, because people care, the governments would have to care. And the governments don't care. Because the politicians also have other things on their mind, like power. And so part of our problem really is focus and attention, so that our governments care to do what government is supposed to do, which is to help make society decent for the people living in the society. Most of the objectives have been called basic human rights or economic rights for more than half a century. We signed in 1948 something called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that Eleanor Roosevelt brought to the world. It's a wonderful, absolutely inspiring moral framework for the world. It said already in 1948, so that's 71 years ago, that everyone should have the right to health, to education, to social protection. And those are within our means, but it hasn't been accomplished for 71 years. These new Sustainable Development Goals, in a lot of ways, are basically saying, live up to these basic principles that we have agreed. We're a lot richer now in 2019 than we were in 1948. All of these practical, simple goals are within reach. Now, the news I want to share with you is the following. These goals are for all countries and also for rich countries to help poor countries. So in some of the cases, poor countries need help. They need extra resources, training, technology. Poverty is really brutal. But these are goals for every country to meet within our own societies. They're not just how can you help someone else, it's about us. And the problem is for the United States, we're not in great shape. For a country that long called itself number one, on sustainable development, we're number 35 on last year's ranking. There are dozens of countries doing better on fairness, longer life expectancy, less poverty, higher education levels, greener environment than the United States. We're not the worst in the world by any means, but for our wealth, which is astounding, $60,000 per every person in this country, $60,000 per capita. Unbelievable affluence in this country on average. we're not achieving sustainable development. And one thing also that this country has that is completely amazing is a depth of talent that's unbelievable. Because you can go all over the country, every part of the country, and find outstanding scientists, outstanding engineers, outstanding policy analysts, outstanding experts in the humanities, everywhere. But where is this talent being tapped? And how are we using it to create the kind of country that we want? So the countries way at the top of the list are the countries of Northern Europe. Ironically, the Wall Street Journal tells us every few weeks, oh, if you do that, you'll be like Europe. Don't be like Europe. If you have a chance, go to Norway, Denmark, or Sweden sometime soon. See how horrible it would be to be like Copenhagen. Oh my God. Shocking. They don't have cars, they just walk around. They obviously can't build buildings, they sit outside and enjoy and have their coffee. And they don't have work, they have 6 weeks vacation. It's unbelievable how they're falling apart. They don't know what to do with themselves. They live for 83 years. Longest life expectancy. It's all so equal, it's horrible. There's no poverty, it's so boring. No, we must be careful. Must be careful. That's what the Wall Street Journal tells us all the time. Very dangerous what's happening up there. Very, very dangerous. So, I produce as part of the UN work a scorecard for each country of where countries stand. And this is a kind of dashboard. Green means you're in great shape. We don't have any greens on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. We have yellow, beige, which is even worse, and red, which is kind of flashing alerts. So in the United States, some of the really noticeable weaknesses are gender inequality, because women are not represented adequately in power, in politics, in corporate level, in the business world. We have incredibly high income and wealth inequality, a world that is a country so prosperous and yet with so many desperately poor people. We have massive waste and pollution. We have huge contributions to climate change. We have a lot of violence in this country compared to all the other high-income countries. And we're not very generous internationally, actually. And so I wanted to run through a few of these numbers. Let me come back to that later, actually. But to say the following, to maybe help our discussion. Really what's at stake in meeting those 17 goals is 6 changes. So I'm giving you lists and lists and lists, but I think that this may be helpful. One is education for all and deploying science and technology, just like this great university, to develop a prosperous society. So quality of education and quality of the research and the innovation environment. That's category number 1. Category number 2 is health. This is also the business of this community. Health and well-being, not just stopping diseases, but actually thriving, living well. I'll want to say something about that in a moment. Third is clean energy, something that we're definitely not doing. I did see what you see every day, apparently, a few times a day, the large rail bringing the coal to the coast so that it can be shipped to China, so that the US-Chinese partnership can destroy the world climate. Because this absolutely will get us all killed if we don't stop this. It's devastating to our environmental safety, and we're not doing what we need to do on clean energy. Fourth is sustainable food supply, and I'll say a little bit about that. Fifth area is smart cities. We're an urban society, 80% urban. the world as a whole is now about 56% urban. It will be 70 or 80% urban by mid-century. People will live in cities. Agriculture, which will remain vital, will be done by robots. It's mechanized already in this country. A farmer that I recently talked to told me that his tractor does all the work now. He still likes to sit on it, but it drives itself. It puts the fertilizer on itself, and he says he reads a book, sits backwards, and watches the field pull away from him, because it's autonomous vehicles and autonomous farming, and this will become ubiquitous. So people will live in cities. That's where the jobs are. Mining, to the extent that there will still be some mining, of course. There will be no miners. And mining was always an incredibly difficult life and a short life. But now machines will do the mining, and they're already in the big mine sites, basically, having taken over. So that will bring people to the cities, and making our cities livable and viable cities is crucial. And then finally, most of this is going to be on the basis of our digital age. And so being able to have a digital age that doesn't turn into mass surveillance, social control, and cyber warfare, but rather turns into true connectivity, the original idea of the internet, online community in a healthy way, is the sixth of the transformations. Now, when we look at each of these, we can evaluate where the US stands, and I want to quickly run through some of these things. In all of these graphs, I'm looking at just the high-income countries. This is the so-called OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, which is the club of the rich countries. And in all of the graphs, I put a red line for the US, so you can see where the US stands in the picture. So this is one case, the proportion of young people with a bachelor's degree. And you can see the US is not the worst, but it's in the middle of the pack. What we're doing in the United States is taking in 65–70% of our kids into higher education, and then a massive dropout rate. They don't complete a bachelor's degree and end up with debt, end up with some college, and some college doesn't help in the labor market, by the way, at all. Some college is basically not different from high school diploma. So we leave a lot of our young people stranded, and we are doing much worse in completion of even a bachelor's than now you can see many other countries, especially in Europe and Asia. In research and development, which is crucial for innovation, the US is still very strong, but we're nowhere near as strong or uniquely strong as we once were and as we thought we were. The US is spending about 2.7% of GDP in research and development, but look at Israel, Korea, Sweden, Japan, Austria, Germany, Denmark, and Finland are each spending a higher proportion of GDP, and China will soon overtake the United States, both in percent of national income and in overall scale of R&D, and is already far advanced, far more, of course, in sheer numbers of Ph.D.s in the sciences. So the U.S. is okay here, but don't think that we're somehow uniquely in the lead anymore on innovation. But when you come to some of the other indicators, all of a sudden we move really to the back of the pack. This is the most recent measure of the share of the cabinets of the world, the ministerial level positions in government held by women. And you can see in the US that in 2017 was at 16.6%. 1 out of 6 cabinet officials is woman. But in Europe, it's 40 to 50% routinely in those horrible Scandinavian countries. Very frightening what can happen if things get out of hand. Now, inequality, out of sight. The measure of inequality is called the Gini Coefficient. It's a number that goes between 0 and 1. 0 would mean everybody has exactly the same income, and 1 means that Jeff Bezos really owns everything. He almost does, but he doesn't quite. And so that's the Gini Coefficient. And among the countries with 2016 data, the United States, of all the high-income countries, is the most unequal country in the world. It's not market forces per se, it's what you do with them. Because the other countries ensure that everybody gets some child care, everybody gets some vacation time, everybody gets health access, everybody gets education, all families get child support, and so on. We don't. We leave people to abject conditions. Our social safety net's barely a net right now. And we end up with this extreme level of inequality. But the point of making the comparisons is to emphasize choice. This didn't just happen. This is because of the way that budget systems work in different countries. And poverty. So this is a definition of poverty used by the OECD, which is a particular definition. It means being a household that is less than half of the median income of the country. In other words, take the median, that's 50% above, 50% below. And if you're less than half of that level, you're deemed to be in poverty. Look how the United States poverty rate compares with these other countries. Again, these frightening places like Finland, Norway, that's Slovakia, Slovenia, Sweden. Europe, on the whole, has, just like it had very low inequality, it's the same countries. Slovakia, Slovenia, Czech Republic, Finland, Norway, Belgium, Sweden, Austria, Poland, Netherlands, France, Luxembourg, Canada, Estonia, Italy, Austria, Portugal, Greece, Spain, Israel, Latvia, UK, Lithuania, and boom, the United States. Same thing on poverty rate. We're at the far end of the scale, highest poverty. What about health and well-being? Same story. First, how much do we spend? Please pay attention to this. Unbelievable. We're spending 18% of our GNP on healthcare. All other countries are spending 10 to 12% in the high income group. Some of the poor countries like Turkey and Mexico spend much less. But we have a healthcare system where the costs are completely out of control. Out of control. That's our basic problem. Because every community has a local monopoly, and the prices are whatever they are. And this is true here, this is true in New York, it's true everywhere in this country. There's no rhyme or reason to these prices except the local monopoly of the private providers. And the government keeping the hands off, because this is the number one lobby, maybe I would say number 4 lobby probably in the US. Maybe the biggest, but I would put big oil as number 1. I would put Wall Street as number 2, military industrial complex as number 3, and private health insurance as number 4. And so we end up with a cost of healthcare which is out of sight. If our costs were down here, everybody could be covered, no problem. But we don't control the costs at all. And what do we get? Of course, life expectancy. We're now 6 years below the lead. Of course, that's not just the health system, that's the social inequality. That's many of the other problems in our society. But we spend like no one else and our health results are getting worse and worse. In fact, unlike every other high-income country in the world, we have falling life expectancy now. That should be the flashing sign. Frankly, whether growth is 3.1% or 2.9%, compared to falling life expectancy, there's no comparison. That's a social catastrophe that in a country of this wealth, of this technology, of this scientific know-how, of these innovations, that people are dying more is a sign of falling apart. And that is actually what's happening. So what is happening? Of course, we're failing in basic ways. Obesity epidemic. #1 in the world, 40% adult obesity. That is primarily our food system killing us. I was going to actually show you one disgusting ad. I don't know if I... Oh, the ads are so disgusting these days. Since you have an wonderful addiction research here, I thought this was the weirdest ad of Juul today in the Wall Street Journal. Okay, this is an ad for Juul. Warning, this product contains nicotine. Nicotine is an addictive. Smoking, quit smoking, start smoking, quit smoking, start smoking, and then switch. Juul. Can anyone explain this to me? This is our country. This is weird. Okay, this was like last week's ad in the Super Bowl. I didn't watch the Super Bowl, forgive me. But the Devour Foods, the porn food ad, did people see that? Yeah, that first of all, of course, using the supernormal stimuli of simulated porn food to sell completely disastrously unhealthy food and to be proud of it. And then they ran the full-page ad, how proud they are of this ad. This is Heinz Kraft. Completely disgusting, by the way. This is with a 40% obesity epidemic. It's not a game. People are addicted to highly processed foods. All of the evidence is that neurologically this stuff is addictive. There was an article in Science last week about how the normal stimuli from the gut to the brain to say stop doesn't work with the processed foods. We know sugar, or we think sugar is addictive in its particular ways, all the sugar additives. So here we are, adult obesity. This is the drug, alcohol, and suicide mortality rate soaring. This is the overdose deaths soaring. This is the opioid use disorders on a color scale where one country stands out at the end of the scale of opioid epidemic. And where did that come from, by the way? Not from Mexico. It came from Purdue Pharmaceuticals. Good old Sackler family. American family paying doctors kickbacks to prescribe addictive medicine and getting away with it. Getting away with it. Because that's corporate free speech in our country. So we're not, and this is depressive disorders, which are also epidemic for adolescents now. Screen time soaring. Young people crying out, I'm addicted to my screen time. Recent surveys showing 60% of young people saying, it's a big problem for me, the screen time. But we also know all the tricks that Facebook is using to keep the screen time. All of them. Because screen time is money. It's selling more ads. And we're organized for money in this country. We're not organized for health, for well-being, for social justice. And interestingly, it's been shown that our GDP keeps going up and up and up, and our happiness has been going down for the last 20 years. Happiness, in this case, subjectively reported by asking people how they feel about their lives. That's going down, but the income's going up. Isn't economic growth great? What kind of profession is this that I'm in? Produce growth, but it doesn't deliver well-being. We should be reporting well-being. Well-being went up this year, well-being went down this year. That would be interesting. It's not unrelated to the economy, but obviously it's not so tightly linked to the economy. And when you look at the rankings of happiness, the United States 25 years ago was around 4th position. Now we're around 18th position. And all of those countries that we definitely should never be, like Finland, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Switzerland, Netherlands, Canada, God forbid, New Zealand, Sweden, they're all much happier in self-report than the United States is. And social trust is going down, as we know, and belief in government is reaching 0, and we're going to see whether it can reach negative. On the energy transformation, whoa, how about that? Greenhouse gases per person. There's one country worse, Australia, which is all coal. But the thing that Australia and United States have absolutely in common is Rupert Murdoch, who owns the Wall Street Journal, Fox News, and has made a career of stopping action against climate change. So these are the emissions of the gases that are causing the global warming. You know we are now already at a higher temperature than we have been in any decadal average, it's called, over the last 10,000 years. We're now outside of the temperature range of the whole period of civilization. And we're on a path to reach 3, 4, 5 degrees Celsius increase. And Mr. Trump says he doesn't believe it. And it doesn't matter. Who cares what he believes? Because it's true and it's dangerous. And we need to do something about it, because it's giving us intense hurricanes, rising sea levels, droughts, floods, mega forest fires, new spread of diseases, and we're reaching more and more tipping points. My guru in this, James Hansen, who was the lead climate scientist for NASA for 30 years and my teacher in this, points out that we're already at or very close to the temperature when the ice sheets are driven to disintegration, meaning that we could be unleashing or maybe already have set in train the disintegration of the ice sheets with several meters sea level rise. The last time Earth was a little bit warmer than now was 115,000 years ago, and the sea level was 8 meters higher than now. So this is what we're doing, and we can't stop because the power of the lobbies is so powerful that basically we end up here. Canada, by the way, awful the same way. Justin Trudeau, nice guy, came in, climate agenda, doesn't matter. He's got to win Alberta. And that means they got to export their oil sands. And that means they have to build Keystone Pipeline and Trans Mountain Pipeline. And no matter that the private sector won't build it anymore, Kinder Morgan said, we can't even do this project. And the government of Canada said, okay, we'll build the pipeline. just to make sure that this dirty stuff can get to China, all for short-term politics. It's disgusting. What are we having these governments for? To wreck us? What do we care if they win re-election or not? If they're wrecking us, which is what they do. So, what does it take in budgets to have sustainable development? Let me show you one key fact. All those very unhappy places that rank at the top of the world happiness tables, all those unhappy places that have longer life expectancy, lower inequality, higher university graduation, they pay more taxes. Exactly what we're told in our country, oh, that would kill us. This is the big myth. Because the whole myth of this country is that the billionaires need more tax cuts. That's the myth. Mr. Bezos has to play you against New York. That's what my article that almost got published was trying to explain to New York why we should try to keep Amazon, actually, even though they were grubby and disgusting in how they did it, and it was accepted for afternoon publication, and then they announced they were leaving in the morning. So the op-ed went to the op-ed cemetery and never appeared. But the truth is, what we're doing is giving tax cuts for the richest people in the world. We're creating more and more of a billionaire class. And then we're told, God forbid you should, Karl Rove today, God forbid you should be socialist like these countries, how horrible it would be. How horrible it would be to end poverty, have kids in school, spend more on R&D, have longer life expectancy, have a more green economy. Horrible, I admit. Okay, so we don't tax ourselves. We're at about 30% of GDP. Sustainable development requires more in taxes. It's the simple truth. No party has been ready to say it. Everyone competes on tax cuts. And the truth is, we cannot afford health, education, green economy, social support, and other things the way we're doing it right now. And so we have no social safety net. We build no new infrastructure. When we travel, which I do every day, I know when I'm back in America when everything's broken at the airport when I arrive. The elevator doesn't work, the escalators don't work, everything's broken down because we don't build infrastructure in this country. They don't even know how anymore, by the way, because the problem is infrastructure is not just a wish thing. You have to plan, actually. You have to think about it. You have to deliberate, and that is something also gone from Washington, I'm afraid. So not only do we collect less in taxes, we run the biggest budget deficit. These places, these high-spending places are in budget surplus. We're running a budget deficit because we just are addicted to tax cuts. Every administration needs tax cuts. Even the Obama administration made permanent the Bush-era tax cuts, except for a little bit at the top, because both parties game in tax cuts. Democrats for the middle class, maybe, or the working class, maybe. Republicans for the rich and the companies. But nobody's paying any bills. And so we end up without being able to finance basic sustainable development. And the other thing we don't do is we don't help any other place in the world. So we're in the process of cutting our aid budget to zero, because why should we give help? And we're told often we're the most generous donor in the world. We are a large donor country, $30 billion per year for development aid. But as a share of a $20 trillion economy, it's about the smallest effort of any high-income country. So we stop being generous. And for small amounts, we could actually end poverty, make sure kids are in school. It would stop wars. It would stop violence. It would stop mass migration because people would have jobs. But we're not doing it right now. what we are doing is making billionaires. The world's organized for billionaires right now. And the number of billionaires has gone up 5 times since the year 2000. And their combined wealth 7 times inflation adjusted. So at last year's list by Forbes magazine, 2,208 billionaires with a combined net worth of $9.1 trillion. And if you took a 5% payout, because I would regard their wealth as our endowment for the world, and you pay 5% on $9 trillion, that's $450 billion a year from 2,000 people. $450 billion a year could end all extreme poverty, all hunger, guarantee schools for every child in the world, guarantee access to primary health care for every person in the world, period. 2,208 people. It's unbelievable. Bill Gates, very generous, you could say. He's given away billions and billions of dollars. In 2010, he pledged he'd give away half his wealth, at least. He had $50 billion then. He's given probably $4 or $5 billion a year since then, and now he has $96 billion. That's how the world works. So let me conclude with 8 quick policies for sustainable development, health, and well-being. First, we do need universal health coverage in this country. We need a single-payer approach, and we need to reduce the outlays from about 18% of GDP to 14% of GDP. Just one thing that I'll say, by the way, my email is sachs@columbia.edu if you want to correspond or ask a question. All the press is saying Medicare for all is unaffordable. It's absurd because Medicare for all is cheaper than what we have right now by at least 2% of GDP and possibly 4% of GDP, depending on how you define the system. So this is, again, lobbyists that make the news. Second, debt-free higher education, as is done in every other high-income country. And that means more federal outlays paid for by taxation of wealthy people, because we need more of our kids being able to complete university and to have the future that they need and deserve. And I believe, by the way, this is a university of the finest tradition, land-grant university. This was one of the best ideas this country ever had. And it was signed into law 1862 in the Morrill Act by Abraham Lincoln. And it was an unbelievably brilliant idea that we should make universities all over the country to serve their communities. And it made America really great. And we should have a 21st century land grant act that guarantees that all kids have affordable higher education all over this country. It's the least we should be doing so that we can achieve what we want, share the benefits, and remain prosperous. Third, we need a full life cycle education and well-being, starting with early childhood development, teaching mindfulness and compassion to young children in school, more leisure time for people, and focus on healthy aging, because this is what well-being is about. So if we were aiming to have growth of well-being rather than growth of GDP, we would aim for well-being. And there's a lot that's known about how to produce well-being. There's also a lot that's known about how to produce misery, which is leave young children in stress, leave them in an environment without cognitive stimulation, don't give them early childhood development. And some of the pivotal research was done here by Craig Ramey, the lead research. And by the way, I had never met Professor Ramey before, but I was on the phone with him today. And there's one study that for me, for 25 years, was the formative study, the abecedarian study. And I said, are you related to that? He said, yeah, that's my study. So that's an incredible, incredible breakthrough. But it tells us, help our children, for heaven's sake. What are we doing as a society? We're $60,000 per person, and we can't use the money right. All this effort to become rich, and then we've lost our minds, actually, in terms of how to enjoy the affluence. Because the first rule is treat your children decently. Treat our society's children decently. Make sure that everyone has a chance. Next, regulate the fast food and the pharmaceutical addiction industry, because this is an addiction industry. It's not about corporate free speech, it's about our public health, for heaven's sake. And we really need to get on top of this. The food processing is killing us, the sugar additives are addicting us, the advertising is completely pernicious, the opioids was a domestic affair, and others, and we don't do anything about it. Decarbonize the US energy system. We need to shift from coal, oil, and gas to wind, solar, hydro, nuclear, and carbon capture and reuse technologies. The Green New Deal idea is right. It's feasible. There's no plan yet, because Washington doesn't plan. But it's the same thing we did with the interstate highway system, or the rail last century, which made Roanoke. You need a map and a plan. And if we took the map out, we'd see how much sunshine we have in the US Southwest. We'd see how much great wind power we have in the northern Midwest states. We have plenty of enough PV everywhere to do a lot of local. We have wind power here and elsewhere. We have tremendous offshore wind. We could power the whole US on renewable energy and do it efficiently and at low cost by mid-century. But we need a framework and we need a plan. And we need to insist that other countries do the same. Shift foreign policy spending from war to development aid and diplomacy. Oh, there's a lot to say here. I wrote a little book recently called A New American Foreign Policy. We're addicted to war. We're in 14 wars right now, ladies and gentlemen. And they're trying to start one in Venezuela as well, to win the great state of Florida next time. Because the Florida anti-Cuban, anti-Castro Cubans just want to overthrow the Venezuelan government, enmeshing us in yet another disaster. So we overspend by 30 times on the military what we spend on development aid, and then we wonder why the world's not stable. Raise tax revenues through taxation of high incomes and wealth, higher marginal income tax rates, ending tax havens, partially reversing the corporate tax cuts, and taxing mega wealth so that we can pay our way, and reverse the decline of trust in government. We need competency. That would be interesting. Honesty. That would be a revolution. End the corporate impunity. Crack down on lobbying and corporate political contributions. There you have it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, that was certainly an inspiring talk. Dr. Sachs is on a very tight schedule. We have just a couple minutes. If there are one or two questions that we could have from the audience, please stand up, speak loudly so people can hear you. Front row.
So what do you think is going to happen?
Happiness is going to break out. Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer are going to hug each other. Donald Trump is going to go into retirement, and we're all going to be happy. No, we're in for still quite a struggle, and the country is deeply divided, and I think the understanding of the issues is not good, and the confusion is very, very high. And so I'm extremely worried. And I'm very worried about the international side because Trump himself is psychologically unstable and could get us in a lot of trouble. And so I'm really worried about the trade wars here and the sanctions here and the tariffs here and the Venezuela this, because our government for the last 50 years has given foreign policy almost without control to the president. That's our biggest problem. So one, we have to safely survive this period. Second, we need, I just hope for some good luck in 2020 that we elect candidates that have the idea of some decency and change in the country.
Yeah, up there. Please stand up so people can hear your question.
I just got back from a visit to Cuba, and I noticed it was not one of the list governments. And how do you reckon that country is in a horrible state?
Yeah.
So how do I recognize and understand and reconcile the differences between the more successful
Right.
regimes that you pointed out that have those types of policies versus one that is, I think, is about 70 years post
Yeah.
the revolution.
Yeah,
What's happening there?
These days, a lot of words are being thrown around, socialism and so on. And there's a huge difference of what Cuba and the Soviet Union was and what, say, Scandinavia is. So the correct term in Scandinavia is social democracy, which means market economy, private ownership.
Jeff, I think your mic turned off.
Oh.
I'm sorry, man.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Yeah. So this is a very good question. Cuba
Had-
had
You know what I did? I think I lost the. Okay.
Right there, that'd
Yeah.
be fine.
Cuba used the Soviet system. The Soviet system was 100% state ownership, basically. That's a disaster. And the history of that system was completely awful. In the history of debate about capitalism, in the 19th century, there was free market capitalism. Then there was what became called communism or socialism. And then there was a so-called middle path, which in the 20th century was called social democracy. And what Sweden, Norway, Denmark did was to say, we'll have a market economy. We have private companies like Ericsson, say, great company, or Volvo trucks and so on. Private, we compete, market economy, all normal. But we tax heavily, and we make universal services for health, education, child care, early childhood development, family leave, and so forth. So my view is they get the best of both, not the worst of both. And it's that middle way that I think is the real answer. With Cuba, the other, Cuba was a repressive and this failed Soviet model. But it was also, because of the confrontation with the US, we never let go. And because of the politics of southern Florida, actually, till today, we don't have a normalization of relations with Cuba. That would speed their change a lot. I have a lot of experience in those kinds of transitions. We're blocking the transitions because we have hardline anti-Castro politics in Florida, which says don't do it. That's the same group that contributes the campaign contributions to Rubio, who's the one that whispered in Trump's ear, we've got to overthrow the government in Venezuela, and creating a big risk of conflict right now, which would be a disaster. So this is really, I think, the answer to this question.
So I'm sorry, in light of the time, we're going to have to call it. Before I do, and we thank Dr. Sachs again, I want to tell him that we have a very strong collaboration with Norway, with several universities there. We have a program with Norwegian universities coming here and us
And
going
you
there.
still haven't collapsed, right?
We're still okay. Please join me again, and thank you, Professor Sachs, for coming back.